There are some things from my childhood I genuinely cannot believe existed. And what's even stranger is that at the time I didn't think anything of it. It was just a normal part of life. And maybe 30 years down the line, you'll be thinking exactly the same way. Where did that particular item or that game or whatever, disappear? For instance, back in the day, if I wanted to watch a film, for instance, which is the 70s and 80s, then you went to a video shop. If you wanted to make a phone call, you used a phone box, one of those red things you see now and again, either with a phone intact or sans phone and not working at all. Unless, of course, you were very lucky and were able to afford to have a phone installed in your home. And if you wanted to find somebody's number, for instance, you had to look through the telephone directory. Or a tradesperson, it would be the Yellow Pages, which was a massive tomb of businesses. So you could take forever to choose who the heck was going to fix your washing machine that weekend or week, whatever. And if you wanted to know what was on TV, of course, then you had to look through the TV guide. Now, the TV guide was included normally in your everyday newspaper if you decided to buy an everyday newspaper, or it would be included as a Sunday supplement in one of the scandalous tabloids that existed at the time, such as the now defunct News of the World, and you were set for the week ahead. And if you wanted to listen to music, of course, then you bought a record or a cassette. That's how it was. So today, many of these things, of course, have completely disappeared. But in the case, of course, cassettes and vinyl, they've made a bit of a comeback, which is awesome, I think. And I'm not talking, about things that have simply become less popular. I'm talking about things that were once really sort of everywhere, or at least they appeared everywhere at that time. And now you hardly ever see them at all. So today, why don't we take a trip back to Britain in the 1980s and have a look at some of the things we had back then that have almost or completely disappeared. So let's start with the video rental shop. If you grew up in the UK in the 80s and the 90s, you'll probably remember those. They were independent sometimes. There was obviously the Blockbuster video rental service. And of course, you'd find some of them in little corner shops or the local spa. They all had, a little video section of their own. But of course, in the big stores, you had a bit of an experience there because you would see rows upon rows of video tapes, VHS tapes, of course, remember. And you'd look obviously at the covers, you'd read the back, you'd put one back, you'd pick up another, and eventually after about 2 hours you'd actually decide on a film that you wanted to watch. If you were lucky, it would have been rewound and you could watch it from the beginning. If you were unlucky, of course, you might skip into an important part of the film which you didn't want to see, and you'd have to wind it all the way back so that you could watch it from the start. And of course, that was, after you'd put it into the VCR, which was the peak, shall we say, of the excitement to come. There was something quite special about that. And of course, you press play, bingo, there was your film. Today, of course, we've got Netflix, Disney, Amazon Prime, HBO, countless streaming services. It's really, we're spoiled for choice. You can search for pretty much any film you want in seconds, and usually, you'll find it. It is it's quite convenient, isn't it? But of course, there is something about the old video shop experience, that had that sort of something special about it. I don't know. At the time, it was. Choosing your film was part of the ritual for that evening you were going to have, maybe with a curry and a few beers or whatnot. Another thing that's pretty much completely vanished from the high street in the UK is the beloved telephone box, because here in Britain, this red telephone box became somewhat iconic. It was part of UK identity. But when I was growing up, you didn't, pass by a phone box and go, Oh, isn't that a wonderful piece of British design? No, you were thinking, I got to make a phone call. And, that could be to the cops, that could be to a friend, a neighbour, whatever. That phone box was a vital lifeline for you. If you were out, of course, and needed to contact someone, you found, yes, a phone box. You needed coins as well for that phone box. You dialed the number and you hoped the person answered. There wasn't any answer phone, of course. There was no, and of course, there were no smartphones or WhatsApp, text messages, no FaceTime, none of that. And certainly there weren't any Google Maps telling you exactly where the nearest phone box was. And here's another thing, you couldn't just take your phone with you. The phone was in the house. Again, I say if you were lucky enough to be able to afford one, usually attached to the wall. And if you wanted to speak somebody, you called their home, and if their parents answered, well, that could be slightly terrifying because, of course, you'd be grilled asking, "Oh, what are you ringing about? What are you ringing about? Have you got a message for him?" No, I haven't, I'm afraid, but he can ring me back later on. Now, here's one that younger viewers might find difficult to understand, and it was called Ceefax. Man, if you had Ceefax on your TV, you were climbing. Man, you were. You were really up there with the best. Because before the internet, we had what was termed teletext. You would turn your TV on and you could basically access pages of information, whether it was news or sport or weather, TV listings, and you'd wait for the pages to load. And I mean, wait, seriously, it was not a fast service, it wasn't, internet based at all. The information would eventually appear on the screen, but it would be, quite slow. And of course, compared with today's internet, I mean, it was pretty primitive. But at the time, like I say, it was amazing. You were like, you know, lucky if you had, I've got a television and it's got Ceefax. Um, you could sit in your living room and get information without buying a newspaper, for instance. And there was something strangely addictive about scrolling through the pages. Sound familiar? Of course, today we just pick up the phone, want the weather, well, we Google it, of course, want the football score, well, you can get that again on Google, want the news, it's all there, isn't it? Ceefax, of course, has gone. But for people who grew up with it, you'll know what I mean and how addictive it could be. As I say, it was it was the business back then. Sadly, no longer with us. And speaking of television, of course, do you remember a time when you actually needed to know what was on? And that required a TV guide. Yes, of course, today you can open up an app and see what's on. But as I say, back then you would have to have this all important TV guide to unlock the secrets of that dark lantern that you had in your living room to know what was available. Maybe you'd have a daily newspaper in which you could find the TV listings for that, for that day. And you'd work out then what you wanted to watch. And there were only a handful of channels back then in the UK anyway. BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. Channel 4 sort of arrived around 1982, and Channel 5, later on. But of course, compared with today, that ain't a lot of channels. We've got thousands of programs now available online. And yet sometimes I do wonder, do fewer choices make the act of choosing that particular program a bit more satisfying because you were actually investing a bit more of your time in watching whatever you'd picked, whether that was good or bad. Um, so if your favourite TV programme, of course, was on at 7 p.m., you had to make sure you were there, because if you didn't, obviously, you snooze, you lose, so to speak. But of course, even now, the TV guide is still popular. I know people who still buy this TV guide religiously, week after week. All the TV stuff's there, not only the 5 channels, but of course, you've got some stuff from Sky TV and, of course, Freeview or FreeSat, you know, people still do it. You might have a bit of a puzzle or a bit of gossip. That's about it, really. But, they're still there. But, yeah. Another slice of classic British life was the milkman. And actually, he has made somewhat of a comeback. I'm so glad that he has as well. You'd wake up in the morning and there would be bottles of milk outside your door, unless some of the school kids had nicked them on their way to school. Um, these were in, of course, proper glass bottles. And if you were unlucky enough to go outside barefoot, you'd quickly discover just how cold these bottles could be. The milkman was part of everyday British life. You'd hear the vehicle coming, you'd hear the bottles clinking, and then, they'd be lined up outside the person's or people's houses. Glass milk bottles haven't completely, of course, disappeared, because I know our milkman actually uses glass bottles. He does deliver them at some strange wee hour of the night. But the sight of the milkman actually delivering milk to practically every household, that is really, in some ways, largely a thing of the past. And don't forget, the milkman it wasn't just milk. Sometimes he'd have, eggs on that, milk float, the battery powered, you know, transport that he carried everything in. And at certain times of the year, nearer Christmas, he would have the Corona pop bottles. So you can have fizzy pop, you'd buy all your Corona stuff off him and you'd return it, get 10p on the bottle, that sort of thing. But all of that, as I say, is pretty much in the past now. Now, back then we had the corner shop, and yes, I know they still exist. I understand that, but there was something different about the old fashioned corner shops. You'd go in for sweets, maybe a newspaper, a loaf of bread, for argument's sake, bottle of pop. And if you were a kid, of course, you'd go in for your sweets or your comics. And we're talking sweets that could be bought at the time, believe it or not, for half a pence, which doesn't exist anymore, or a penny. You could buy blackjacks for a penny, sort of rhubarb and custard sweets, sherbet fountains, etc. All of that sort of stuff did not cost the earth, but maybe a penny or 10p, And I remember buying comics for 10p or 12 pence, wasn't a lot. Well, back then it wasn't a lot. But I could buy, sweets and comics, as I say, for under 30 pence. Seriously, I could. I could have a decent time with a little bit of pocket money. I didn't need a lot, because things were a heck of a lot cheaper. And of course, this corner shop would stand as a rescue beacon sometimes, because back then, oh yes, this is no word of a lie, neighbours or parents could write you a note to take to the newsagent, and you could go in there, and if they were kind and they knew you because you went in most days, you would give that note to the newsagent and he would give you a packet of 10 Benson and Hedges cigarettes or whatever, um, simply because he'd had a note from a neighbour who obviously wanted some cigarettes, and you were out and about as a kid, and they could send you off as like a bit of an errand to get them. And there was no trouble whatsoever in doing that. It was done all the time, common practice throughout the UK. Now, I've touched on this already, of course, and it is the Yellow Pages, that massive tome that contained tradespeople. As I say, it was the Yellow Pages if you needed business. Oh, yes. And as I say, if you wanted somebody to repair whatever item it was, or wash your carpets, I don't know, or come and fit blinds, you had to look for those businesses, by hand. And I do mean look. It was not an easy task. You could spend a lot of time looking for that tradesman. They might be good, they might be crap, but you had to look, and that's how you did it. Pages and pages of businesses, plumbers, electricians, restaurants, even builders, car repair shops, everything that you needed would be in that book under the Pacific category. Um, of course, today, again, you just put something in, Google knows your location, bang, bang, bing, bing. All these businesses come up for your particular need, and you can contact them, and you can see the reviews, and you can see if they are a reliable operation or whether they're a Mickey Mouse operation, that sort of thing. But imagine explaining to a child today that there was once a huge yellow book that contained telephone numbers for all the businesses locally. I mean, we're only talking locally as well. If you had the businesses for the entire country, it would be insane, honestly. Um, if you told them that, they'd probably think you're making it up. It's crazy, isn't it? Now, of course, we're getting into music, and that is where this one's making somewhat of a comeback, and it is the cassette tape. For people of my generation, cassettes were a huge part of growing up. You could buy an album, of course. You could record songs from the radio. Yes, in music piracy was around back then, recording songs from the radio, way before Napster and all of that business. Because the mixtape, of course, which was where you recorded songs off the radio, was quite important. You stick it in, obviously, your car, your cassette player, your car. You've got it. And of course, your Walkman. You'd be spending, of course, time to know what songs you wanted on it. And of course, you had to wait for those flipping songs as well to come on the radio if that's the way you were getting them. And you had to, of course, bypass the DJ, jumping in either at the beginning or like too quickly before the end of the song, so you could get at least a decent copy down to listen to. And again, as I say, it was getting the timing right because these tapes had a limited amount of space. You had a C60, a C90, and maybe you've heard that Barrow House song that says about C30, C60, C90. Well, that's what they're talking about, the cassette tape, each one having a different time limit. So you could record one side, when it was full, turn it over and record the other side. So it was specifically important to try and get that song the right length so it would fit snugly on to the end of that tape. Now, here's another thing that almost disappeared overnight, and it is the ordinary camera. If you wanted to take, photographs, obviously you needed film. And that meant you couldn't immediately see your photographs. Oh, no, no, no. You pressed the button and you hoped you got it right. Then you would take the film to the camera shop or Boots or wherever where your film would be developed. Yes, taken into a dark room or eventually a machine that could do this job and bring your photos to life. Um, so yeah, you had to wait. Sometimes you had to wait a week to get them. You could perhaps later on you could have that hour service that they offered as things developed and developed. Sorry, and got better. But imagine that today. You take 50 photographs and you do not get to see any of them, let alone Photoshop them. You don't even get to see these things until maybe next week. You'd probably go flipping mad now, wouldn't you? But it also meant photographs felt a little bit more special. You couldn't, alter them. As I say, what you took was what you got. You didn't take 200 pictures of your dinner for a start, no chance. Your mum would slap you around the head if you did that. I know mine would have. You had a limited number of shots. So you thought about what you wanted to take a photograph of. Now, I have covered this in a video on its own, but the VCR does deserve its own entry here, really, because this was one of the most amazing pieces of technology at the time that became available. You could record TV. Yes, you could record TV programs. Who would have ever guessed? You could also watch films, as I say, rented them from that video store down the road. You could rewind. Yes, you could fast forward. You could pause so that you could have, a freeze frame. And if you were particularly brave, oh yes, you could try to program it to record something while you were out. And some people were darn experts at this. They knew the video timing system absolutely bang on. That was an achievement, believe me, it was, because programming a VCR honestly could feel really like you needed a degree in engineering to do it. You'd look at the instructions, press a series of buttons and then hope it actually recorded the program. And there was nothing worse than coming home expecting your favorite program only to discover that you'd recorded something off the wrong channel. So, what have we actually lost? But I do think we've lost something else, and that is the experience of waiting. We've become incredibly entitled and impatient. We used to wait for films, we'd wait for albums, we'd wait for photographs, we'd wait for television programs. Yes, even if that meant waiting until 3 a.m. We'd wait for friends to phone. We'd wait for the milkman, even. Yes, because even he could be late. And perhaps waiting made us appreciate things more. When everything is available instantly, it is easy for nothing to feel particularly special or important. It does lose its value. So, if you've enjoyed this video, of course, a nostalgic trip way back, then consider liking, subscribing, and of course, I will see you very, very soon. Take care, guys, and have a good week.